and welcome. I'm Pam Sugerman, Dean of the Faculty of Arts, as you just saw, and shameless self-promotion, feels like that at least. It's my pleasure to extend a very warm Ryerson welcome to everyone here this afternoon, and I really do hope that you're enjoying your time on our campus. I'd like to begin this discussion debunking national narratives, unpacking bigotry unpacked, by acknowledging the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. I realize that land acknowledgements, as important as they are as a symbol of acknowledgement, are in some circles beginning to feel a little bit perfunctory, and I hope you take this with absolute sincerity and as a first stage toward a larger and much longer process of reconciliation and hopefully redress. I'd like to, as I said, welcome you to this really important panel today, a discussion of bigotry, of attempts to confuse, complicate, challenge national myths in this country. And I'd like to just begin. I won't take up too much time because I know you're here to listen to our esteemed panel members, but I just want to share one personal story. And this is something that I shared with Haroon and Alok early in our discussions about the panel, the formation of this panel discussion. And I'll just tell you that I'm a third generation Sansei, Japanese Canadian of Japanese descent, and as such, my family has faced a lot of racism in Canada. My grandparents and my parents, and in fact all of my family, were interned during the Second World War because of our race, because of our the way we looked and perceptions of our loyalty to this country. And though there was an acknowledgement of the wrongs of what happened to Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, that acknowledgement took place, called redress, in the 1980s, late 1980s. I mean, as many of you know, the effects of racism reverberate and they're passed along across generations. But certainly, I haven't, over the past several decades of my life, faced the kind of overt racism that I faced as a young child growing up in the city of Toronto, which back then was far less diverse, much more homogeneous than it is today. When I was a child, I'd often be called Jap, Chink. People would say to my family, go back to where you came from. But there was some class elevation. I came from a poor working class family, and with education and entry into the professional ranks, you're immune from some of that. So racism came in different ways, but not as blatant as it had decades ago. But when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States not that long ago, as we all know, a lot of what was just beneath the surface, lurking beneath the surface, came to the fore. And just a matter of days after the US election, I was at the corner of Yonge and Dundas. And, Yonge and Dundas is a busy place, busy intersection, and there were a lot of people. It was on a Friday early evening, and someone was pushing me. It was a white man in probably his mid to late 30s, and I told him not to push me because there was no place for me to go because it was so crowded. But he continued to push me, and then I told him off. And because, why would I be treated like that? He said, get out of the way. And Then when I told him off and challenged him, he turned to me and said, "Get out of here, you yellow skin." And I just was shocked. I was completely shocked. I hadn't heard in the city of Toronto something like that in a long, long time. And I thought to myself, I was so unsettled, I didn't even know what to say. But I thought to myself, this is really scary. And this is one of the reasons it's important that we have the discussion today with Alok, Haroon, and Kimberly. So let me very briefly introduce our panelists. Alok Mukherjee, I'm sure many of you know him by reputation, if not personally. He's a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts and the Office of EDI, otherwise known as Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, here at Ryerson. And prior to his appointment at Ryerson, Alok was chair of the Toronto Police Services Board from 1992 to 1994. Prior to that, he was vice chair and acting chief commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He's a very highly regarded, important commentator on human rights and race relations with a distinct focus on and expertise on policing. Haroon Siddiqui, many of you know as well, as a distinguished visiting professor in the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Communication and Design here at Ryerson. And we're very happy that he's joined us. He's had a distinguished career, not necessarily in the past. He continues to have a distinguished career, holding a number of senior editorial and management positions, including news editor, national editor, and editorial page editor at the Toronto Star. Haroon is a former president of PEN Canada, a writers group that stands for free speech. And at Ryerson, he's particularly interested in fostering conversations around diasporic experience and the representation of groups, diasporic groups in Canadian society. Kimberly Murray, also very highly respected and known publicly, leads the Indigenous Justice Division at the Ministry of the Attorney General. And Kim is a member of the Kanesatake Mohawk Nation and is currently the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. She has devoted many years to representing marginalized groups, the most marginalized groups in Indigenous communities, and has certainly furthered our understanding of Indigenous injustice around Indigenous issues, the relationship between the legal system in Canada and the Indigenous community, and has done some incredible advocacy work. So without further ado, I will turn your attention to the panel and Patricia Albanese, who is the Interim Director of Arts and Contemporary Studies and plays a key role in Congress Ryerson programming, will moderate questions and answers afterwards. Thank you.
Sego Kwekwe, Haudenosaunee, Kimberly Murray of Kanesatake Mohawk Nation. Thank you very much, Dean, for the introduction. And I also want to say Nawe to you. Thank you for sharing your personal experience. I know it's not always easy to share these things, terrible things that we hear and things that happen to us on a daily basis for some people. I do also want to recognize the traditional territory, and I thank you for doing that as an institution, because it was important to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we acknowledge our history, and that's part of acknowledging the history, is to acknowledge the territory. So I was asked to be on this panel. I have a blank slide, so you don't know what's happening next. But I have some slides that I'm going to show you as I speak. And I say to people, I like to put pictures up so you're not looking at me, because I really hate public speaking, believe it or not. So I want to say this: bigotry. simply put, is intolerance of those who are different than you. Canada is preparing to celebrate its 150th anniversary. 150 years of intolerance against Indigenous people by settlers to this land. Not just subtle, not unconscious bias, but overt, direct, targeted racism and oppression against the original occupants of these lands. I submit that every sector, private and public, has contributed to, and many continue to contribute to, this intolerance. 150 years, that's 15 decades. I have 10 minutes, and in my 10 minutes, I'm going to provide you with some examples of Canada's bigotry against Indigenous people. Perhaps the most known and talked about as a result of the recent work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is the Indian residential schools. For over 130 years, 13 of Canada's 15 decades of existence, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were apprehended from their loving homes and communities, separated from their parents, and placed in residential schools. The whole raison d'etre of the schools was to kill the Indian in the child. Overt, direct attack on Indigenous peoples by settlers who believed that their religions, their values, and their ways of life were superior to Indigenous ways. In these jails, and I do call them jails, as kids were literally locked in some of these schools. Some schools actually built cells inside of them to keep the kids in. Children were physically, sexually, emotionally, and spiritually abused. Over 150,000 children were taken to these places that were government funded and church operated. That's over 1,000 children per year of operation, that young lives were stolen. Over 7,000 children died in these places that Canada called schools. The law of Canada allowed for this massive apprehension based on bigotry. A less known example is the creation and operation of Indian hospitals, racially segregated hospitals created to isolate Indigenous peoples from settlers for fear that Indian diseases posed a threat to the settler population. Most of these hospitals were underfunded, understaffed, and staffed by church officials. Just like in the residential schools, the Indian hospitals were places of abuse, medical testing, and ill treatment. They operated from the late 19th century to the late 20th century, segregated Medicare in Canada based on bigotry. Many would argue that the current healthcare system in Canada continues to treat Indigenous people differently than others. One need only look to examples such as that exposed by the Brian Sinclair inquest in Manitoba, or look to the north in Ontario. How is it that we can allow a 5-year-old boy, Brody Meekus, from Sandy Lake First Nation, to die from strep throat in 2014? A third example of bigotry, the 60 Scoop. As the residential schools were being shut down, child welfare organizations stepped in and increased the apprehension of Indigenous children from their homes to place them in non-Indigenous families through the foster care and the adoption systems. The government ran the Adopt an Indian and Métis program, whereby Indigenous children were sold to white people. Many argue that the 60 Scoop has not ended, but rather continues today, as there are more Indigenous children in care today than there was at the peak of the Indian residential school system. Again, children are being taken away from their families and communities, being sent away, sometimes hundreds of miles away, to be raised by non-Indigenous people, disrupting the transmission of Indigenous culture, language, and knowledge. Just like the residential schools were an attempt at cultural genocide, so too is the massive apprehension of the child welfare system. Indigenous children's well-being continues to be determined by the bigotry of the settler society. A fourth example of bigotry against Indigenous people is the illegal disposal of industrial chemical waste into the Wabigoon English River system in 1962. The communities of Grassy Narrows and White Dog have suffered decades of mercury poisoning. Here we are, 55 years later, and the river has yet to be cleaned up. One has to question if the two impacted communities were not First Nation communities, but rather small settler towns, would there be a 55-year battle to clean up this river? Or would it have been done by now? Are Indigenous lives less worthy of immediate action? Some would argue that it appears to be that way. This leads me to Walkerton and the outbreak of E. coli in the water supply. Several people died and thousands were sickened in 2000. A public inquiry was called immediately, and in January of 2002, the inquiry released its first report, making several recommendations that have all since been implemented. But yet, across Canada today, we have over 140 First Nations communities with no access to clean drinking water. There are First Nations babies suffering from severe skin rashes from bathing in contaminated water. There's no public inquiry. There is no quick response by the Canadian government to fix the problem. Is it because 7 people died in Walkerton that there was a quick response? Well, we have over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada right now. There hasn't been a swift response to those deaths. It took decades of advocacy and a change in government for the national inquiry to be called. An inquiry that doesn't have the powers that the families want it to have. The power to find answers. The power to reinvestigate their loved one's disappearance or death. There are no shortages of recommendations aimed at ending violence against Indigenous women and girls. What we don't have is implementation. Why is that? Is it bigotry? Let's try and unpack that in our discussion this afternoon. So Canada, in the next 150 years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had this to say. Reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. And in order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and we all must take action. We all must take action to move from a relationship of violence and separation to one of mutual respect and dialogue. We need more anti-racism training. We don't need more anti-racism training in directorates. We need more work on decolonization. If we don't decolonize our institutions and systems, the bigotry will continue. And that'll be our next 150 years. And we have to do better than that. So I look forward to our conversations and the remaining of the panelists speaking this afternoon. Miigwech, nawe.
Dean Sugerman, Patricia, Charlene McKenzie, whom many of you may not know, is the one who has made this conference work. Thank you very much. Alok and Kimberly, thank you all for coming. We're all familiar with the history of racism in our country, from the cultural genocide of the Aboriginal peoples that Kimberly has just spoken about. The head tax against Chinese Canadians, the concerted racism that was directed at South Asians in general, through the continuous journey, regulation of 1908, the systematic barring of Asians from crown lands as well as certain jobs, the internment of Japanese Canadians that Pam referred to, the continuing bouts of anti-Semitism, and the shameful refusal to let the passengers land from the Komagata Maru in 1914 and St. Louis in 1939. I'll jump to the post-charter era of multiculturalism, when overt racism subsided, and we had bouts of what Max Yalden, that famous legendary chief commissioner of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, called garden variety chauvinism, directed in different forms, for example, against the Sikh turban and Sikh kirpan, whining about observant Jews wanting the right not to work on the Saturday Sabbath, and on and on. And of course, the continuing and totally unacceptable and not so subtle brutalities, police brutalities against African Canadians that continues to this day. But the post-9/11 hatred and vitriol and demonization of Canadian Muslims is in a league all its own in contemporary Canada. The frightening thing about it really is that it is not restricted, as we like to think, to right-wing nuts. It has become, Islamophobia has become part and parcel of our national mainstream narrative in politics, as well as in the media, and in day-to-day conversations that people have. Even smaller liberals say the nastiest things about Muslims that they dare not say against any other identifiable group and get away with it. When we think of, as Canadians, when we think of Islamophobia and Islamophobes, we either think of Europe, Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, or we think of the United States, Ben Carson, the brilliant Newt Gingrich, and the likes of other people, and of course ending with Donald Trump. But Islamophobia and Islamophobes are very much alive and well in Canada, as we have seen. And there is no sense that it is going to end any day soon. The January 29 massacre of Muslims in a mosque in Quebec City obviously did not happen in a vacuum. Alexandre Bissonnette is Canada's very own André Breivik. Mr. Bissonnette is a fan of Donald Trump and is a fan of Marine Le Pen. And it's instructive that Kelly Leach and Kevin O'Leary are also great fans of Donald Trump in varying degrees, of course. We took comfort, and we still take comfort in the fact that the figures like Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, and so on are not part of any government. They sort of do the railings from the opposition and from the sidelines. But we were really shocked when Donald Trump won the election. He was suddenly in office. Yet Canadians were not apoplectic when Pauline Marois, known anti-Muslim bigot, won an election and started implementing the Charter of Quebec values, which was directed mostly at Muslims. And while she was only proposing to do things such as fire all hijabi women from the public payroll, Stephen Harper, Jason Kenney, Chris Alexander, Kelly Leach were already fanning Islamophobia across the country and implementing Islamophobic policies across the nation. Marois and Harper were implementing Trumpism in Canada long before Mr. Trump introduced it in the United States. This Canadians have taken long to acknowledge and understand. As Professor Cornel West said last night, Mr. Harper was a clever Donald Trump. He had the same Trump-like propensity to tie all Muslims to Muslim terrorism. distribute collective guilt on all Muslims. The same exaggeration of the threat of Muslim terrorism, implying that terrorists were coming to a neighborhood near you any day today or tomorrow. The same policy of banning Muslim Syrian refugees on the grounds that they were all potential terrorists. The same Trumpian boycott of mainstream Muslims as well as Muslim organizations and demonizing them and delegitimizing them, and relying instead on a colonial policy of relying on 6 or 7 hand-picked, obedient, pliant Muslims, house niggers, if you will. The same fear-mongering as Trump about barbaric cultural practices such as the horrible genital mutilation and honor killings, terrible crimes that are not restricted to Muslims but are in the public mind associated with Muslims. In some instances, actually, Harper and Magua out-Trumped Trump, even though most Canadians don't realize it. Magua and Harper tried to ban the niqab, for example, either from citizenship ceremonies or in Quebec from public services, which Trump hasn't even spoken about it. Both of them associated the niqab and even the hijab with oppression and even terrorism, which Trump hasn't. Harper openly and officially and defiantly gave preference to Christian and Yazidi refugees from Iraq and Syria, something that Trump has had to roll back in his second executive order against refugees and immigrants ordered by the courts. I mean, we live in the age of Muslim terrorism, that goes without saying, but also for the ever war against terrorism. The war on a noun that has led to bombing 7 Muslim nations and much alienation among young Muslims everywhere. The last point I want to make is that wars need propaganda. They need propaganda to keep public opinion on side. So wars are waged as much in political forums and in the media as it is waged on the battlefields. Propaganda includes outright lies, such as the presence of non-existent WMDs in Iraq. And it includes soft tactics, such as going to liberate Afghan women. Afghan women need liberating, but we did not invade Afghanistan to liberate them, period. Our leaders and our media repeatedly assure us that we are waging war on terrorism, but we are not waging war on Muslims, let alone Islam. But it's not easy to separate the two. It is not easy to separate the Muslims there and the Muslims here. It was inevitable that such non-stop propaganda would lead and deteriorate into cultural warfare on Muslim citizens here and in the United States and Europe. If you demonize Muslims there, you end up inevitably demonizing Muslims here. If you're busy saving Afghan women, you have a propensity to want to save Muslim women here as well, regardless of the facts. If you believe, and if it's been drilled into you that Afghan women, Afghan men, Arab men, and so on are misogynistic, it follows that Canadian people and Canadian men of Afghan, Iraqi, and other origins may be misogynist as well. So this is the kind of new world that we live in. And of course we can say, Muslims are not being interned like the Japanese Canadians were, but Muslims feel psychologically interned and hounded every day. And it is ironic that the same people who want to save Muslim women, the biggest target of anti-Muslim hatred are Muslim women too. Muslim women are being harassed, pushed, shoved in public spaces, not by Muslim men, but by anti-Muslim men and Christians. Many parallels have been drawn to the 1930s, and many of them are not exact. But this much is certain, that Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism. It's the same fear and loathing of the other, the same exaggerated fears about a minority. Familiar anti-Jewish tropes are being recycled against Muslims. It used to be said, and unfortunately still is, that Jews are taking over the world. Now the same thing is being said of Muslims. Jews were incapable of assimilating and integrating into society. Same thing is being said about Muslims. It used to be said that Jews are going to impose a religion on everyone. Now the cry is, Sharia is coming, Sharia is coming. 25 states in the United States have taken executive or legislative measures against a Sharia that cannot possibly come. It's irrational. And we in Ontario also have had our anti-hysteria Sharia in 2004 and 5. Muslims cannot be maligned any more than they have already been. The real issue here is what is at stake. And this is the parallel to the 1930s. What is at stake is that democratic, secular values are being undermined. That is the greatest danger that Islamophobia poses today. And it is in the interest of all Canadians and all secular-minded people to be alert to what is happening and reassert our Canadian values. Thank you very much. Alok.
Good afternoon. I'm going to talk about national narratives, looking at some issues around policing. As Dean Sugarman said, I have had an association with policing. Just one small correction. I served as chair of the Police Services Board in Toronto from 2005 to 2015, before I found refuge here in Ryerson. So I want to begin with two of Canada's enduring national narratives. The first, represented by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, is that everyone has certain fundamental legal and equality rights. The phrase "everyone has" implies that these rights are pre-existing and the Charter only continues them. Further, the Charter suggests that these are unfettered rights, subject only to those, and I quote, "reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society," unquote. The second is that the public agencies which police our communities are a quote-unquote service and not a paramilitary force with deadly hardware. They are there to quote-unquote serve and protect us through a harmonious service delivery model called community-based policing, and that they do so within a democratic model of civilian oversight and governance. The provincial legislations governing policing across Canada link the two narratives by requiring that this service will be provided in a manner that is consistent with the Charter and provincial human rights laws. Yet the historical and current experiences of Indigenous peoples and Muslim Canadians that you just heard about lead us to question whether the benevolent construct of Canada embedded in these two narratives holds true for not only these two groups, but also other minoritized and racialized groups. The continuing controversy in Toronto over the exclusion of police officers in uniform and armed from the forthcoming Pride March, as demanded by Black Lives Matter Toronto, reinforces this questioning. These counter-narratives force upon us two conclusions. First, the notion that police are an entity that serve and protect is not true, especially for everyone. And second, that as a result, everyone does not enjoy equally all the rights guaranteed in the Charter until and unless they are enforced on appeal by a court of competent jurisdiction under Section 24.1 of the Charter. I want to consider some of the reasons behind the gap between the benign trope of police as a service that serves and protects everyone and the reality as experienced by groups such as indigenous peoples, homeless peoples, and members of Black and other racialized and minoritized communities. I will end with a question about the current trend of explaining police interactions with groups like these being the result not of racism, sexism, ableism, or homophobia, etc., but of quote-unquote implicit or unconscious bias, a concept developed in the US based on psychological research on the impact of human behavior of hidden bits of knowledge stored in the brain. Issues such as police mishandling of murdered and missing indigenous women that Kimberly talked about, disproportionate criminalization of Black and other racialized youth, killing of people in mental health crises, especially those from racialized backgrounds, or excessive ticketing of homeless people are only partly due to overt discriminatory ideas like racism or classism on the part of individual police officers. When controversies arise because of one or more events like these, the focus tends to be on holding individual police officers to account. Sometimes there are demands for attention to systemic factors. Both are important demands, holding the individuals to account and looking at systemic issues. However, in my view, individual misfeasance and systemic deficiencies are insufficient experiences. On a meta level, police agencies constitute the coercive arm of the state. In our hierarchical societies, the state represents, protects, and promotes the interests of the privileged, defined by race, class, gender, etc. Their overall function is to preserve order and protect property and person against threats. The RCMP, and as National Police, was established to quote-unquote pacify the First Nations and the Métis of the West, in other words, given a colonizing role. Local police forces, as in Toronto, were created by members of the elite for the protection of their person and property. This is why in Canada, as in the US, police officers were equipped with guns right from the beginning. Further, as policing became more systematized and defined through legislation in Canada, police officers were given the discretion to decide when to draw their guns, as well as made holders of public office supposedly to ensure their independence. These provisions are very much alive and well in the law to this day. Even a police chief cannot direct frontline police officers on how to use their discretion. In recent times, as neoliberal state policies have resulted in greater socioeconomic inequality, fewer supports for those in distress, and a reduction in preventive programs, the perception of threat to order has grown. Functions that are unrelated to detection of crime have become police responsibilities. Generalist, heavily armed police officers, the bulk of whose training is in use of force and who have the legal authority to kill, now spend much of their time in dealing with social issues like mental health, domestic violence, homelessness, schoolyard bullying, and so on. I suggest that this combination of the original coercive role and the subsequent expansion of the scope of policing inevitably increases the list of those who are deemed to pose a threat to order. A consequence of this is the type of strategies that are used in policing today. I've been struck by how similar these strategies are across North America. These include, for example, the so-called anti-violence strategies, the placement of armed police officers in high schools in the name of building relationships, the advent of dedicated policing for public housing and post-secondary institutions, use of geomapping to deploy policing resources whereby certain neighborhoods consisting largely of poor, indigenous, black, and other racialized people are more heavily policed than their affluent, predominantly white counterparts, and demand for ever-increasing access to personal information. The impact of all such strategies has been to deepen the alienation of the police from the most marginalized segments of society, the dominant society's others. For the latter, the police are an occupying coercive institution. In a report to the Toronto Police Services Board in November 2013, I had said, and I quote, "Racial profiling as a form of discriminatory policing, even if by impact rather than intent, should not be seen as a problem of bad behavior on the part of some individuals. It needs to be seen as the result of systemic practices involving policing strategies," unquote, strategies that are developed by the senior leaders of policing institutions. Yet policing strategies seldom come under the scrutiny of oversight and governance bodies. Much of their work happens, or appears to be, to deal with individual conduct. Ironically, even there, the results are meager. The number of times that public complaints succeed or use of deadly force is found to be excessive is minuscule. Nevertheless, almost all our provinces have elaborate, supposedly arm's-length oversight and governance entities to hold police to account, ensure policing consistent with the laws of the land, and thereby obtain continued public consent for policing. The intent is to guarantee public legitimacy through what is described as policing by consent. I have begun to wonder if these bodies are not more symbolic than substantive. They work hard, and the state dedicates significant resources to pay for them, thus creating in the public mind the perception of policing subject to strong public accountability. That perception is perhaps even more necessary now. The post-9/11 state's preoccupation with terrorism and national security has affected local policing, adding to the list of the others who pose a threat. It has led to the militarization of policing and increased its surveillance role. Today's police officers dress in a dark, foreboding uniform, carry a belt full of hardware around their waist, and wear a Kevlar vest all the time, as if there can be threat and danger at any moment. Evidence, of course, does not support this, but the symbolic impact on the public mind, as well as the effect on officers' behavior, can be significant. I believe that arbitrary stopping, questioning, and carding of people from certain groups when they are not engaged in or suspected of any criminal activity is the result of these added considerations of security and terrorism. Carding, that is, recording and retention of information about innocent people in police databases, is, I suggest, a form of surveillance. And finally, there is the informal culture of policing. In a recent article in the Toronto Star on May 25th, I compared it to the submerged bigger part of an iceberg. As I noted in that article, and I quote, "Developed through history, folklore, mythology, symbolic action, and memorialization, it has a huge impact on officer behavior. As the policing research by British academic Jerome Skolnick reveals, informal culture shapes the police officer's working personality. John Van Manen, who did an extensive field study of a large urban police force in the US, pointed out in a 2005 paper that one of the aspects of this informal police culture is classification and labeling of people. Van Manen concluded that police officers categorize people in three groups: suspicious persons, know-nothings, and the assholes. According to him, people who fall in the third category, the one that I find the most interesting, and I quote him, are suspect not because of what they do, but who they are, how they look, dress, talk, walk, and where they live, etc. He says that keeping them under control in the name of protecting society is an important practical and moral justification for the police officer's existence. This aspect of informal police culture, taken together with the other factors underlying policing that I have just discussed, provides, I suggest, an explanation as to why the national narrative that police are there to serve and protect under democratic civilian oversight on behalf of the community is false. This is not to say that there are not individual police officers who are bigoted. No doubt there are those. My contention is that the issue of discriminatory policing needs to be seen through a more complex lens, using the sort of framework that I have outlined. And for this reason, I am disturbed, finally, by a trend that has emerged to explain police conduct, namely that it is mostly due to implicit or unconscious bias. Bias, that is, which the individual is not even aware of. Drawn from psychological research in the 1990s, it was applied to policing in the US by certain academics who have close ties to policing. North American police leaders have embraced it with alacrity. As psychologists Mahzarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald explain in their 2013 book titled Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. Hidden biases are, quote, bits of knowledge about social groups. These bits of knowledge are stored in our cultural environment. Are stored in our brains because we encounter them so frequently in our cultural environments. Once lodged in our minds, hidden biases can influence our behavior toward members of particular social groups, but we remain oblivious to their influence, unquote. They add, nowadays, the term unconscious cognition appears frequently, although it was surpassed in the 1990s by the related term implicit cognition. This is a good summary of the concept that has gained currency in policing circles. As an explanation of conduct, it is somewhat akin to saying, the devil made me do it. This explanation causes unease for several reasons, and I will list two. First, it distracts attention from the specificities of power and privilege based on race, class, sex, sexual orientation, ableism, etc., by proposing that bias is a universal human phenomenon. Granted, everyone can have a bias. However, it is the power to do something with it against another person or group that makes the critical difference. Second, it potentially absolves the perpetrator of responsibility for their action, making it extremely difficult for holding anyone to account. As Banaji and Greenwald point out in the subtitle of their book, the people are good. They just don't know the hidden biases in their brains. It seems to me that this concept of hidden biases of good people undermines conversation about and struggles against racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, and all such expressions of power is very much a product of the times and the political climate in which we live. I wonder if the readiness of police leaders to adopt it to explain police conduct is not part of an effort to legitimize and perpetuate a narrative about policing that, in the view of many people and groups, is just not true. Thank you.
One question? Okay, one question. The dean says one question.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, and being from Thunder Bay, every time I go up to Thunder Bay and talk to people in Thunder Bay right now, they say that they are very worried about the city and what's happening in the city right now with the racism against Indigenous people and the deaths in the river. But I hear also how the citizens of Thunder Bay want to make it a better place, and so I think there's a lot that needs to happen in our institutions, and I can give you an example just in the Ministry of the Attorney General. You know, I was hired 2 years ago to create this new division, the Indigenous Justice Division. We have never had an ADM in the province of Ontario in charge of Indigenous justice. So what does that look like? What we're doing is trying to change the way decisions are made in the province by changing the way we operate and by the people we hire and the way that we, you know, even do briefing notes. We do a lot of trying to educate people in the ministry, and it's very siloed and it's very separated. It's a daily challenge, but if you don't have the structure in place with the Indigenous people working in that structure, it'll always stay the same. So, but I think it's really important that, you know, we have to make space in Canada for Indigenous laws, Indigenous systems, Indigenous languages to thrive, because we spent so many years, 150 years, tearing them apart. And so it's going to take some time for communities to be able to have their own laws, have their own systems, have their own schools, have their own teachers, and teach the way that they want to teach. I mean, this is not an Indigenous way of learning, sitting in a room like this. This would not be the institution that our elders would tell us is the way that we teach young people or old people. This is a colonial system that we're in. So, you know, it's going to take time, and it's very important that we put the effort and the resources to support that revitalization of Indigenous ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Done? Thank you.